Diansheng and Meilong 6x6s, not exactly new puzzles. The Meilong came out in around 2019 and the Diansheng is slightly newer but not very new either. And I just wanted to see if there's a 6x6 that can compare to my 4x4. Right now I'm just going to give an out-of-the-box impression. I'm probably going to attach my full opinion later on. Yeah, I just want to give a quick look at what to expect when you pull these two out of the box. So the Meilong, like out of the box, actually feels faster than what my Ultra GTS is, which is in turn faster than my MGC, but that's partly because I didn't use my MGC much at all and the loop hardened and slowed down the cube. I would say this is actually quite nice in terms of speed, and it's also really solid and high quality feeling. Like, I don't find that it's going to deform in my hand or anything. But the downside is that it's extremely squared off, and this is evident in its reverse corner cutting. And the outer layers also look much smaller than that of a mainstream 6x6. Most mainstream 6x6s would use an outer layer about 1/5 of the cube's size, but this one clearly looks smaller. This is the non-magnetic. At the time when it came out, actually the factory magnetic Meilong wasn't out yet. This one came out in 2020. I do find that it's heavier than what I would expect from the Meilong brand. It's actually not exceptionally heavy. I do think the weight is quite average, and it's quite okay for a 6x6, but when I think of the Meilong brand, I think of extremely light cubes, and this doesn't seem to follow with that same image. But overall, I do think this cube is quite underrated. It's nowhere as bad as how like some other videos portrayed it. I can still do elks reasonably, and it's not like locking up with every slight misalignment. Like, yeah, the reverse corner cutting isn't great, but then I don't misalign these layers frequently as well if I'm just doing outer layer turns. For the Diansheng, it's actually even faster and lighter than the Meilong 6x6, which I definitely do enjoy. It has a scratchier feeling and its tension very loose, so it gives off the impression that this is actually much cheaper and much lower quality in terms of build. But in terms of performance, like, it has magnets, it has bigger holes, it has the layer ratio, so definitely performs better. However, I do think the loose tension does affect the stability quite a lot, so even though this has magnets and this has no magnets, I actually feel that this one is more solid and stable. I do think this one has potential, it just needs some loop and tensioning. For mechanism, the Diansheng just looks like a typical 6x6 with not much to talk about, but like, it does have a bigger mechanism than the MGC6, and I think possibly a bit bigger than my Ultra, but I don't want to take my Ultra apart. It's tensioned quite tightly and I don't want to mess with that tension. The Meilong, on the other hand, it's a bit different. Firstly, the anchors are huge, like even bigger than the Diansheng one. Like really huge anchors. It's also built in the old 3-piece design, which I'm not a big fan of, but it used to be the dominant design. Whereas this one has the more modern 4-piece design where the stock is 1 piece and head splits into 3. I do think the reason why I think this is actually a better design is because with a unified stock, you don't have to split the weakest part or the smallest part, which is the stock, into like 3 like this one. But in this case, the stock itself is quite thick, so I don't think it's going to break that easily. The main benefit of doing things like that is you can reduce the piece count in terms of like injection molding, so you might actually lower the cost of the cube even more. For setup, I'm going to talk about the Diansheng 6 first. So I tension it about 180 degrees of screw tightening, like tighter than the stock tension, and I looped it with the closest loops I have to the Yo loop bundle, which is supposed to be weight 5 Mystic, Dignitas and DNM, but since this is a big cube and I don't want to slow it down too much, I used weight 3 instead of weight 5. Dignitas is more or less unchanged. I don't have Mystic in my possession, so I use Silk, and my DNM supply is really limited, so I use just loop shadowless kick because the bottle is just much bigger and I have more loop, and it's also another water-based loop, so the effect is quite similar. After all of that, the Diansheng 6 is extremely nice. The cheap scratchy feeling that it had out of the box is completely gone, and it's about as smooth as my Meilong 4 and it has an added like soft plush feel. And the cube is a lot more stable than before, and it is still crazy fast. The magnets are a lot weaker than the MGC6, which is a huge plus specifically for my turning style, and I really like its performance. I can hit a very high turns per second with it and use less effort per turn, which is really the key highlight of using this cube. However, I do still find it a bit flimsier and less stable than what I would like, and it's also a little bit catchy. So overall, it's a decent cube, but at this stage, my average with the Diansheng 6 is still a little bit slower than my main, like at least by a few seconds. For a budget cube, I think this is really good. There are a few more upgrades that I think can potentially bump up the performance of the Diansheng 6. The first is just polishing to get rid of the frosted feel, which is exactly what I've done to my Meilong 3 and 4. These two were originally frosted cubes, but I polished them to be shiny and like they just look a lot better and they grip a lot better as well. The second is core corner magnets, which I did to my Ultra GTS. The Diansheng especially would benefit from this because it is a little bit less stable than what I would like. Plus, core corner magnets actually risk slowing down the cube, but the Diansheng 6 is just so fast, so I don't see a slight slowdown as much of a big impact. Additionally, because of the 4-piece corner design, like the base of the corner is a big hole for you to like, basically just put a magnet in. And thirdly, this is not specific to the Diansheng. I would say this upgrade can be done to any 6x6, and I would say that this more for the Meilong than the Diansheng, and that's the 9-hole version of the Florian mod. I think this one in general, because parity elks will tend to cut through the middle, so I do think it just looks a bit better, and it's just a slight touch over the original 4-hole version of the mod, which is what the Diansheng came like pre-incorporated with. For the Meilong, it already came with some factory loop, and out of the box, its tensions were already quite alright. Like the amount of factory loop is also quite perfect. It totally covers up the inside of the cube, but at the same time, nothing is leaking on the outside. And for a non-speed cuber or beginner with no setup experience, like if you just don't care about speed, you just want to have a nice feel when you pull this cube right out of the box, I think the Meilong 6 actually does quite a decent job at that. But as a speed cuber, I wanted to optimize it a little bit more, so I tensioned it about 90 degrees tighter than the stock tension to make it harder to pop or get deforming lockups, which I think the Meilong and the Diansheng are both not immune to the deforming lockups. But I don't really get them a lot because of how tight I tension them. And the loops I added to the Meilong 6 are the Just Loop Y71 and the Kelvin's High Viscosity, just to make it a bit gummier. If I really had to set up the Meilong 6 the way I want it, I would end up going quite deep into modding territory. So obviously magnetization and the 9-hole version of the Florian mod will be included as my top 2 priorities, and polishing the cube to get rid of this frosted finish will be the third. But again, just like the potential upgrades I talked about for the Diansheng 6, these are all like borderline modding in the Diansheng's case and hardcore modding in the Meilong's case. I won't be doing it to cubes that I currently don't own. In base form, the Meilong is actually not good at all for speed cubing. It feels really smooth and stable to turn, but that's about it. The timings I get on this are like straight up bad. It's at least using red 6x6 level, which is about 20 seconds or 30 seconds worse than what I would do on my main. It can get slightly annoying when transitioning to one turn from another because it's just really squared off. With the Meilong 6, I also sometimes run into this internal piece like problem where the piece is halfway out of its position but not exactly out of the cube, and it can get really annoying to fix. I think this is partly due to the internal pieces being really small and thin, which is the trade-off for having big roots. So I think these big roots actually help to improve the cube's stability, but at the same time, like since they take up a lot of space, the space needed for the second and third layers roots are much smaller than like that of the outer layer, and this kinds of flush the internal pieces to one corner when it comes to cross-sectional cuts, and it really makes these two pieces really small. Overall, I'm quite disappointed with the Meilong 6. This lineup has a top tier flagship level 3x3, 4x4, 10x10, 11x11, 12x12 and 13x13, and like an 8x8 and 9x9 that were at least best on the market at the time of release, as well as a 5x5 that can at least reach the Yisu V2M like budget cube level. So I have no idea what happened to the 6x6 and 7x7. They've been marketed as speed cubes, but then they clearly don't perform up to the standard of the rest of the Meilong lineup, especially the 6x6. Like the layer ratio and how squared off it is just looks like it's not meant to be speed cube. However, I do feel that there is an audience that may like the Meilong 6 in its base form, and that would be the puzzle modding community. I've actually seen images on the Twisty Puzzles forum where this cube was used in some mods. So the square pieces and the more proportional layers can actually make your hand mod look better, and it may also be easier to do filling and extension. For making things like 4x4x6, 6x6x4, I think this one is quite a good option. And for Siamese cubes, it will also look less distorted. And if you're going to saw through a cube to make a barrel, fisher cube or cutter cube, I think you probably wouldn't want to saw right through a magnet and like have your saw to have like metal touching metal. or just cutting the magnet right out the cube and wasting the point of having the magnet inside in the first place. The Meilong 6 itself is of decent quality, not to be confused with performance, so to make it clear, the Diansheng has better performance, the Meilong has better quality. Pieces themselves feel sufficiently strong, the cube doesn't feel like it's falling apart, and like it feels quite well put together. And also it's available in black, which may be the preferred option for puzzle models, especially if your final result of the mod is not going to follow the standard color scheme, or it's not even a 6-sided cube. So my overall recommendation for a budget 6x6 would still be the Yisu V2M, and if you have a few more dollars to cash, just go straight for the MGC. Like, going by the argument that like beginners are the main target audience of budget cubes, I would say that the YJ cubes require the least setup and they present the best first impression of any like 6x6 in terms of performance to price ratio. Popping is still an existing complaint, and you will need to tighten them anyway, but at least they are quite decent out of the box already. And for the Diansheng 6x6, I would actually not recommend it as a beginner puzzle, but as a more higher level speed solving like puzzle, I think it's quite a good option if you have a very light turning style. For the Meilong 6, I wouldn't recommend it unless you're a puzzle model or you want something to experiment with.